Racist cops. Mock black man on trial. Unaware he's the director of the FBI. The Millfield County Courthouse buzzed with Monday morning activity, attorneys shuffling papers, clerks calling cases, and the usual parade of defendants waiting their turn before Judge Eleanor Winters. In the back row, officers Ray Harkins and Justin Peltz leaned against the wall, coffee cups in hand, surveying the room with the casual authority of men who considered this their domain. Another day, another round of excuses. Harkins muttered, a 20-year veteran whose badge had long ago become a shield for his prejudices rather than a symbol of protection. Peltz, his protege of 2 years, nodded in agreement. At least the coffee's decent today. Their attention shifted as a distinguished black man in an impeccable charcoal suit entered the courtroom, taking a seat in the third row. He carried himself with quiet confidence. His salt and pepper hair closely cropped his expression, revealing nothing as he observed the proceedings. "Check out the suit," Harkins whispered loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. "Bet he's some ACLU lawyer here to make trouble." Peltz snickered. $10 says he's here for the Williams kid. You know, the one we picked up last night." What neither officer knew, what no one in the courtroom knew, was that the man they were mockingly speculating about was Marcus Reynolds, the newly appointed director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 3 weeks into the job, and not yet publicly announced, Reynolds was in Millfield for what should have been a personal matter, his nephew's college graduation. Instead, he found himself in court because that same nephew, James Reynolds, had been arrested the previous night while walking back to his dorm. The charges were vague, suspicious behavior, and resisting arrest. But the pattern was familiar. As a black man who had risen through the ranks of law enforcement over 3 decades, Reynolds had seen this story play out countless times, though he never expected it to touch his own family. Case number 2023 CR 187 State versus James Reynolds, the clerk announced. Marcus straightened slightly as his nephew was led in, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his lean frame. James was a pre-law student with a spotless record and a bright future, at least until last night. Their eyes met briefly, Marcus giving an almost imperceptible nod of reassurance. "Approach the bench," Judge Winters instructed, her voice carrying the weariness of 20 years on the bench. As the proceedings began, Marcus Reynolds made a decision. He would not reveal his identity, not yet. A public spectacle would only complicate matters and potentially compromise the larger issues at stake. Instead, he would observe, gather information, and then address the situation with the full weight of his authority when the time was right. What he didn't realize was how quickly that moment would come. "Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended at 11:42 p.m. exhibiting suspicious behavior in a high-crime area." The prosecutor explained, a young man whose confidence exceeded his experience. When officers approached, he became confrontational and attempted to evade questioning. "That's not true," James interjected, earning a sharp look from his public defender, a harried woman juggling 3 other cases that morning. "Let your counsel speak, Mr. Reynolds," Judge Winters warned. From his seat, Marcus Reynolds noted every detail of the proceedings, the prosecutor's vague language, his nephew's frustrated expression, and the judge's apparent disinterest in looking beyond the officer's report. Most telling were the smirks exchanged between Harkins and Peltz whenever James or his attorney spoke. "Your Honor," the public defender finally said, "my client is a Dean's List student at Millfield College with no prior record. He was simply walking back to his dormitory after a study session at the library." The arrest report is vague about what constituted suspicious behavior, and there's no body camera footage despite department policy requiring it. Officers Harkins and Peltz reported that their cameras malfunctioned. The prosecutor countered smoothly. "It happens occasionally with equipment." Marcus made a note on the small pad he'd brought. Equipment malfunctions were indeed common, especially when the footage might contradict an official narrative. "Bail is set at $2,500, Judge Winters announced after minimal deliberation. "Next case." As James was led away, Marcus slipped out of the courtroom and made 2 calls. The first was to his chief of staff, "Need full background on Millfield PD. Quietly. Priority." The second was to Eliza Washington, a former civil rights attorney now practicing in Millfield, whom he'd researched that morning. By afternoon, James had been released on bail, and the 3 of them, Marcus, James, and Attorney Washington, sat in her modest office 2 blocks from the courthouse. "They had no reason to stop me." James insisted, still wearing the clothes he'd been arrested in. "I was just walking. They asked what I was doing in that neighborhood like I didn't belong there." Eliza Washington, a formidable woman in her 50s with locks pulled back in a neat bun, took detailed notes. "This fits a pattern we've been seeing with increased stops of minority students. The department denies any racial profiling, of course." "Of course," Marcus replied, his tone measured. "Ms. Washington, I'd like to retain your services not just for my nephew's case, but for a broader look at the Millfield Police Department's practices." She looked up, studying him with newfound interest. "That's an expensive undertaking, Mr. Reynolds. May I ask why you're willing to fund such an investigation?" Marcus considered his response carefully. "Let's just say I have a professional interest in law enforcement accountability." Washington's eyes narrowed slightly. "Very well. But I should warn you, this town protects its own. The police department, the prosecutor's office, even some judges, they're all part of the same system." "I'm familiar with such systems," Marcus replied, a hint of steel beneath his calm exterior. "And I've seen them change when the right pressure is applied." What none of them anticipated was how a chance encounter the very next morning would dramatically accelerate their plans. The following day, Marcus received the background report on Millfield PD from his office. The findings were troubling, but unsurprising, a pattern of complaints regarding racial profiling, disproportionate stops and arrests involving minorities, and evidence suggesting an unofficial quota system. Most concerning were internal communications obtained through a whistleblower, including text messages between officers joking about hunting season when college students returned to campus. Armed with this information, Marcus expanded his investigation meeting with Dr. Harriet Chen, the Dean of Students at Millfield College, who had been documenting student complaints about police interactions for years. "I've tried working through official channels," she explained, showing him a folder of correspondence with the police department and city officials. "The responses are always the same denials or promises of looking into it that never materialize." By evening, a plan was taking shape. Marcus, Washington, Dr. Chen, and 2 trusted student leaders had outlined a coordinated approach, documenting patterns, gathering testimonies, and preparing for strategic legal action. As Marcus left the campus, he noticed a police cruiser following his rental car. He maintained his speed, signaling properly at each turn, giving them no reason to stop him. Nevertheless, after 3 blocks, the cruiser's lights flashed. Reynolds pulled over, unsurprised to see officers Harkins and Peltz approaching. License and registration. Harkins demanded flashlight deliberately aimed to blind Reynolds. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" Reynolds inquired politely, hands visible on the steering wheel. "Tail lights out," Peltz said, from the passenger's side, though Reynolds knew this was false. As he handed over his identification, a standard driver's license that gave no indication of his position, he noticed Harkins's expression shift slightly. "You're not from around here, Mr. Reynolds. What brings you to Millfield?" "Family business," Reynolds replied simply. Would that family business include that boy from court yesterday, James Reynolds? Harkins's tone had changed, becoming more confrontational. "Interesting coincidence, same last name." "He's my nephew," Reynolds acknowledged. The officers exchanged looks. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Harkins ordered. Reynolds complied while discreetly activating the recording function on his phone. What followed was a textbook case of pretextual escalation, a false claim of smelling alcohol, a field sobriety test that Reynolds passed perfectly, and finally, handcuffs. "This is an unlawful detention," Reynolds stated clearly for the recording. "I've complied with all lawful orders and passed your sobriety test." "You'll comply with whatever we tell you to," Harkins snapped. "You people come to our town thinking you're above the law." "You people," Reynolds repeated. "Could you clarify what you mean by that, Officer Harkins?" In the back of the patrol car, Reynolds maintained his composure as the officers spoke freely, unaware they were being recorded. "Chief's gonna love this," Peltz chuckled. "Another one of those Reynolds troublemakers?" At the station, Reynolds was photographed and fingerprinted, still not revealing his identity. Only when they attempted to place him in a holding cell did he finally speak up. "Before this goes any further," he said calmly, "I think you should know who I am." "Yeah, and who exactly are you?" Harkins asked with a smirk, clearly expecting some claim about knowing the mayor or having an attorney. "I'm Marcus Reynolds, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." He stated simply, his voice level. "My credentials are in my jacket pocket, which you confiscated." The officers froze disbelief, evident on their faces. "Nice try," Peltz finally said, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Let's check that pocket then." When they retrieved his credentials, the blood drained from both officers' faces. The FBI director's identification was unmistakable. This has to be fake," Harkins stammered, though he knew it wasn't. "It's quite real, Officer Harkins," Reynolds replied, "as is the recording I've made of this entire encounter, which includes several civil rights violations and clear evidence of racial profiling." The station erupted into chaos. The booking sergeant called the chief, who arrived within minutes, profusely apologetic and visibly shaken. "Director Reynolds, this is clearly a misunderstanding." "No, Chief Donovan, this is clearly a pattern," Reynolds interrupted. "A pattern I've been investigating since your officers wrongfully arrested my nephew yesterday." News of the FBI director's detention spread through the department like wildfire. By morning, it had reached the mayor's office and local media. Chief Donovan attempted damage control, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but the recording, which Reynolds had already secured by sending it to his office, told a different story. The crisis deepened when Reynolds, now free and treated with nervous deference, held a press conference alongside Attorney Washington and Dr. Chin, announcing a formal Department of Justice investigation into the Millfield Police Department's practices. "What happened to me and my nephew is not an isolated incident," Reynolds stated to the assembled reporters. "It is representative of a systemic problem that affects countless citizens who don't have the benefit of my position or resources to fight back." As he spoke, FBI agents were already serving warrants at the police department, securing records and electronic devices before they could be altered or destroyed. Chief Donovan, watching the press conference on television in his office, received a call from the mayor, "Fix this or resign today." But it was already too late for quick fixes or scapegoating. The investigation Reynolds had initiated would be thorough and impartial, conducted by agents with no connection to him to avoid any appearance of personal vendetta. For officers Harkins and Peltz, the realization of what they had done and to whom they had done it was beginning to sink in. Their careers were likely over and criminal charges were possible. But more devastating was the knowledge that their actions, which they had always justified as just doing their job, were now exposed for what they truly were. 3 days later, the preliminary findings of the FBI investigation were presented to the Millfield City Council in an emergency session. The evidence was damning: systematic targeting of minority students, falsified reports, disabled body cameras, and a quota system for arrests that disproportionately affected certain neighborhoods. Most incriminating were the text messages and emails between officers, including Harkins and Peltz, revealing explicit racial bias and coordinated efforts to harass specific groups. "This isn't just a few bad apples," the lead FBI investigator explained to the stunned council members. "This is a departmental culture that has been cultivated and protected for years." Chief Donovan, seated in the front row, stared straight ahead, his career and reputation disintegrating with each slide presentation. The mayor, sensing political disaster, had already distanced himself, claiming he had been misled about department practices. Meanwhile, Marcus Reynolds prepared for the most difficult part of his mission, ensuring that justice was served without appearing to use his position for personal vengeance. He had recused himself from direct oversight of the investigation, appointing his most experienced and impartial deputy director to lead it. But he would have to testify about his own experience, and that testimony would be crucial. The day of the hearing arrived with national media camped outside the federal courthouse. Inside, the atmosphere was tense as Reynolds took the stand, now publicly known as the FBI director, following an accelerated announcement from the White House. "Director Reynolds," the federal prosecutor began, "please describe the events of the night you were detained by officers Harkins and Peltz." Reynolds recounted the encounter methodically, his testimony enhanced by the recording that was played for the court. As the officers' voices filled the room, their casual racism, their deliberate escalation of a routine stop. Harkins and Peltz sat at the defense table, eyes downcast. "At what point did you identify yourself as the FBI director?" the prosecutor asked. "Not until I was about to be placed in a holding cell," Reynolds replied. "I wanted to experience exactly what any other citizen would experience in that situation." "And why was that important to you?" Reynolds paused, considering his words carefully. "Because the true measure of justice isn't how we treat the powerful or connected. It's how we treat those with no voice, no resources, and no recourse. What happened to me was unfortunate, but what happens daily to countless others is tragic and preventable. The defense attorney, attempting to salvage something from the disaster, suggested that Reynolds had deliberately provoked the officers by withholding his identity. Director Reynolds, couldn't this all have been avoided if you had simply identified yourself from the beginning? Reynolds leaned forward slightly. The question isn't why I didn't identify myself. The question is why identification should be necessary to receive fair and equal treatment under the law. The courtroom fell silent, the simple truth of his statement hanging in the air. No further questions, the defense attorney said quietly. As Reynolds stepped down, he passed the defense table where Harkins and Peltz sat. For the first time, they looked directly at him, seeing not just the FBI director, but a man whose dignity they had attempted to strip away and failed. The verdict came swiftly. Both officers were found guilty of civil rights violations, false imprisonment, and filing false reports. The judge, acknowledging their cooperation in the broader investigation into departmental practices, sentenced them to 3 years in federal prison, far less than the maximum, but a clear message nonetheless. Chief Donovan resigned before he could be fired, and the mayor announced a complete overhaul of the police department, including independent oversight, mandatory body cameras with strict compliance monitoring, and comprehensive bias training. 6 months later, Marcus Reynolds returned to Millfield, not in secret this time, but as the commencement speaker for his nephew's graduation. James, who had considered transferring after his arrest, had instead become a student leader in the campus movement for police accountability. As Reynolds approached the podium, he surveyed the audience, parents and students, community members, and local officials. And in the back, a group of Millfield police officers in their new uniforms, part of the reform department now led by a chief committed to community policing and equal justice. When I last visited Millfield, Reynolds began, I experienced firsthand what many in marginalized communities have always known, that justice is not always blind, that authority is not always right, and that systems designed to protect can sometimes become instruments of oppression. He paused, looking directly at the police officers. But I also witnessed something powerful in the aftermath, the capacity for systems to change when confronted with truth, and the courage of individuals within those systems to acknowledge failures and work toward genuine reform. Reynolds gestured toward the police officers at the back of the auditorium. The measure of justice in a community isn't the absence of mistakes or prejudice. Those are human failings we all must confront. Rather, it's how we respond when those failings are exposed. Do we deny, deflect, and defend the indefensible, or do we acknowledge, amend, and advance toward something better? In the audience, James Reynolds sat tall, his graduation cap slightly askew, his eyes fixed on his uncle with unmistakable pride. The new Millfield Police Department isn't perfect, Reynolds continued, but its willingness to confront its past and reshape its future represents the best of what public service can be. The officers serving today have chosen a difficult path, rebuilding trust in a community where that trust was severely damaged. Their commitment deserves our recognition and support. Several of the officers straightened, slightly surprised by the generous acknowledgement from a man they had expected to condemn them. To the graduating class, I offer this observation: justice isn't an achievement to be completed, but a practice to be maintained. It requires vigilance, courage, and the humility to recognize that even our most cherished institutions must evolve. As you leave this campus and enter your professional lives, remember that systems are created by people and can be changed by people, including you. After the ceremony at a small reception for graduates and their families, Reynolds found himself face to face with Officer Michaela Diaz, one of the new recruits to the reformed Millfield Police Department. "Director Reynolds," she said, extending her hand, "I wanted to thank you for what you said today. Many of us joined the force because we believe in what policing should be, not what it sometimes has been. The hardest reforms are the ones that require us to examine our own biases and behaviors," Reynolds replied, shaking her hand. "How is the department adapting?" "Honestly, it's challenging," Diaz admitted. "Some officers resisted the changes and left. Others are trying but struggling with new approaches. But our new chief makes it clear every day our job is to protect and serve everyone equally, not to control or intimidate." James joined them, now changed out of his graduation gown into a suit nearly as impeccable as his uncle's. "Officer Diaz has been leading community outreach at the college," he explained. "She's been instrumental in establishing the student liaison program." Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Building bridges before there's a crisis, that's real preventative policing." As they chatted, Reynolds noticed a familiar figure approaching hesitantly former Chief Donovan, now working as a security consultant, according to the investigation updates Reynolds still received. "Director Reynolds," Donovan said, his voice subdued, "I wasn't sure if I should approach you, but I wanted to say something." Reynolds excused himself from James and Officer Diaz, moving slightly apart with Donovan. "I'm listening," he said simply. "I failed," Donovan stated bluntly. "Not just the department or the community, but the oath I took. I told myself I was supporting my officers, but I was enabling behaviors that violated everything the badge should stand for." Reynolds studied the man, noting the absence of excuses or deflection. "Recognition is the first step toward redemption, Chief Donovan." "I'm not looking for redemption," Donovan replied. "Just trying to own my part in what happened. The department is better now, stronger, more accountable. Sometimes the best thing a leader can do is step aside when they've lost their way." Reynolds nodded, respecting the hard-earned wisdom in those words. "What will you do now?" "I'm working with police academies on ethics training," Donovan said, "using Millfield as a case study in how departmental culture can corrupt good intentions. It's not much, but it's something." As they parted, Reynolds reflected on the unexpected outcomes of his ordeal in Millfield. What began as a personal injustice against his nephew had catalyzed meaningful change in a system that had resisted reform for decades. The officers who had mocked him in that courtroom were serving time, yes, but more importantly, the department they had represented was being transformed. Later that evening, as Reynolds prepared to return to Washington, James walked him to his car. "You know," James said, "when they arrested me that night, I was angry and scared, but mostly I felt powerless, like nothing I could say or do would matter because the system wasn't designed to hear me." Reynolds placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder. "And now," James smiled slightly, "now I know systems can change. Not easily or quickly, but they can change. That's why I've decided to go through with law school. Not corporate law like I planned, but civil rights. I want to be part of that change." Reynolds nodded, a surge of pride warming his chest. "Your mother is going to blame me for this career pivot, you know." "Probably," James laughed, "but she'll get over it." As they embraced, Reynolds thought about the long arc of his own career, from a young officer determined to change policing from within to the FBI director with the power to hold entire departments accountable. The work was far from finished in Millfield or anywhere else. But today, in this small college town that had once humiliated his nephew and handcuffed him without cause, something had shifted. It wasn't just policy changes or personnel replacements, though those were necessary. It was a fundamental recalibration of what justice meant and who deserved its protection. A recognition that badges and titles didn't confer moral authority, only the responsibility to use power with greater wisdom and restraint. As Reynolds drove away from Millfield for what would likely be the last time he passed a patrol car parked at an intersection, the officer inside one of the new recruits nodded respectfully as he passed. Reynolds returned the gesture not as the FBI director acknowledging a subordinate, but as one public servant recognizing another, both committed to the same essential promise: equal justice under law. It wasn't a perfect ending. Justice rarely provides those, but it was a beginning worth building on.